Okay, so this is the lecture for the integumentary system. There are the objectives. You have that in your PowerPoint. Functions of the skin, and pretty sure I left all this in the PowerPoint too. Functions of the skin are protection. It protects us from pathogens. So bacteria and viruses have trouble getting through our intact skin. Chemicals, especially chemicals, changes in pH. Ultraviolet radiation, and also protection through our sensory reception, because we have receptors for touch, pain, pressure, hot and cold, and we have hair receptors, which in the evolutionary scale really don't matter as much now as they used to. Production, the skin helps to convert vitamin D to a usable form for us using UV radiation. In secretion, we secrete sweat as a way to control our body temperature, and sebum. Temperature control, we have passive temperature control because our skin allows heat to escape and to protect us from the cold, but also we have blood vessels in our dermis and hypodermis that help to actively, the blood vessels dilate or constrict to conserve or release heat. And then fluid balance, through sweating, we can help to maintain some fluid balance, but also our skin is relatively waterproof, so we don't just absorb water when we step in it. Three main layers of the skin. The epidermis is the most superficial layer. Dermis is that middle layer. And then the subcutaneous layer is also called the hypodermis. Okay, and really the subcutaneous layer isn't a true layer of the skin, but it kind of is too. So we're just going to say it is. So the subcutaneous layer, or the hypodermis. Epidermis is the thinnest layer of the skin. It has no blood vessels. But like we talked about with the connective tissue, or in the tissue unit, there is this basement membrane that epithelial tissue lies on. So there is the basement membrane. There are 5 sublayers. So we'll start superficial to deep. And the 5 sublayers are the stratum corneum, stratum lucidium, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basale. You can see stratum basale pronounced many different ways, from basale, 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 but it's basale. Really, we're only going to talk about the most superficial and the deepest layer in detail. The corneum has keratinized cells, so that protein keratin makes up these keratinized cells. Okay, and the keratin helps to make that most superficial layer waterproof, or at least water resistant. And the basal layer, the deepest layer, that has basal cells, And those basal cells are constantly dividing. These basal cells are right on the border between the epidermis and the dermis. So they're able to divide and be living cells because they have a blood supply. Okay, and there's also in this layer you have melanocytes. You have melanocytes, and you have, and the melanocytes are there to produce pigment. We'll talk more about those. And there's also Langerhans cells. Let me rewrite that. There we go. It's better. Langerhans cells. And those Langerhans cells help to form an immune response for that layer of skin. The epidermis, starting from most superficial to deepest, the superficial layer is all dead cells, and the deepest layer is where we have the living cells. As the cells move up away from the blood supply, they die, and that's what creates this superficial layer of dead cells. And then, so because of that, we get a new skin approximately every 4 weeks because this top layer gets sloughed off. Okay, the dermis is the thickest layer. It has collagen in it, and if you remember from the tissue unit, collagen gives a lot of strength to the tissue. So, and it also gives it some stretch, but the strength comes in that you can pull the skin and it doesn't pull apart. And then the elastin is what gives it more of the stretch. The elastin helps to allow the skin to move over those underlying structures, so over the muscle and bone without tearing. Also in the dermis we have blood vessels. And the blood vessels are there to give blood supply to the dermis and stratum basale. There are nerves in the dermis. And then the dermis is what forms our fingerprints with the dermal papillae. So we'll see that here. And we'll see that here. And then, so those dermal papillae, the dermal papillae is what actually forms your fingerprints. And you can see how they get transferred up here to make these ridges and valleys that are going to form your fingerprints. And that's the dermis. Subcutaneous layer, also called the hypodermis, mostly loose connective tissue, and adipose. Remember, there's also going to be areolar tissue somewhere in there. And the dermis really, the hypodermis just allows your a place for the blood vessels and nerves to pass through, and also some insulation from the adipose. Sweat glands. Sweat glands are specialized glands. Remember, these are all exocrine glands because they lead through tubes or ducts to the outside of the body. We have, another name for sweat glands is sudoriferous glands. So another name is the sudoriferous. Sudoriferous glands are also called sweat glands. Two types. We have the apocrine sweat glands, these ones down here, and these ones open on the hair follicles. So you see this apocrine sweat gland opening onto the hair follicle. We have a lot of the apocrine sweat glands in our uroanal region, armpits, back of the neck, and these glands also release a chemical called a pheromone. And pheromones are chemicals that act as an attractant or to identify a person based upon the pheromones that they give off. So these pheromones are also how, like, say, dogs recognize each other by sniffing each other. So the apocrine ones release in the hair follicles, a lot in the uroanal region, armpits, back of the neck, and they release pheromones. The eccrine sweat glands are their primary function is just to release sweat. And they do that through these pores that are separate from the hair follicles. Okay, and sweat is made up of water, salt, and urea. So those are the three main components of sweat. Modified sweat glands. So these are sweat glands that are don't release sweat but release other things. And we have that the ceruminous glands produce cerumen, which is earwax. So we find these in the ears. And mammary glands are modified sweat glands that produce milk for mammals. Another accessory structure of the skin are the sebaceous glands. And sebaceous glands release an oily substance, a lipid-based substance called sebum. Okay. So they release something called sebum. Usually we find the sebaceous glands associated with hair follicles. They are holocrine glands. So look back at your notes from the tissue unit. Holocrine glands. And we have sebaceous glands everywhere except for our palms and the soles of our feet. Sometimes when we get to our sebaceous glands, we'll back up, and when that happens, when you get a backup of tissue in there, or sebum in the sebaceous gland, you get these things called blackheads. And the blackheads is just the sebum has backed up in there, but the lipids on top of the sebum that is exposed to the air become oxidized. And so you get these blackheads, and it's black because the sebum is oxidized, which makes it turn black. Sometimes those blackheads become infected, or just the sebaceous glands become infected, and you get whiteheads. And then a more severe infection, you get a boil. Okay, and then the boil can lead to even more severe infections. And acne vulgaris is that very common acne that happens during puberty. So it's called acne vulgaris. And that's where you get a lot of these sebaceous glands backed up and infected. All right, hair follicles. Hair follicles sit in these tube-like depressions. The hair grows from these epidermal cells, and the epidermal cells are found down here next to this hair papilla. The hair follicle itself the hair root, I should say, the hair root is everything that's embedded within the skin. This is called the hair root. And then the part that extends outside of the epidermis is called the hair shaft. And then here where we have those epidermal cells, that papilla is where the blood vessels are that are just going to feed those epidermal cells. Finally, this erector pili muscle. The erector pili muscle is what contracts to allow the hair to stand up on end. So when you have the hair stand up on the back of your neck, it's the erector pili muscle pulling. It also helps create those goosebumps. Okay, the nails. Nails are just protective coverings over the ends of our fingers and toes. The nail plate is the actual fingernail we think of, or the toenail. The nail bed underneath here is just epithelial tissue. And the lanula is where the nail is growing from. So that's where the nail grows from.